So here we are. We are into September now, but as we all know, it is still 2020. There have been a lot of jokes, of course, about this year and how it feels like so many things are going so wrong. We've got things like this. Yes, a nice cup of 2020. He gets his eyes poked out. Then there's this. Gonna ask my mom if that offer to slap me into next year is still on the table. My husband sent me this one recently. I had a sign in my room that said laugh, but the L into the A fell off, and now it only says ugh, and that's just perfect. And that probably sums up many of our experiences this year. We've tried to laugh and find joy, and too many times it feels like that laugh has just turned to ugh. Our story today introduces us to a couple whose laughter had turned to ugh. Abraham and Sarah were called by God to go from their country and settle in a new place, and God would bless them there. God makes a covenant with them, and actually in 2 weeks we'll dive into that covenant in more detail. But God in that covenant promises them that God will give them descendants as numerous as the stars. And a number of years have gone by, and there was still no child, let alone numerous ones. When Abraham was 99 years old, we read in Genesis 17, the Lord appeared to him again and says again, Abraham, you will be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. In fact, your wife Sarah is going to bear a son. And the text says Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? This has got to be a joke, and a cruel one at that. Well, more time goes by, and the scene shifts to a hot mid-afternoon day. It's way too hot to work, and so Abraham is sitting by the entrance of his tent, half awake, half dozing, just trying to stay cool. It seems his laughter has turned into an ugh in that hot, oppressive summer sun. But as he drowsily sat in the shade, all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he sees 3 men standing near him. And Abraham jumps up and runs to them and bows down and asks them to stay for a little bread and water. Now, hospitality was incredibly important in that society, and Abraham is a very good host. He runs in and he tells Sarah to get fine flour. Our translation says 3 measures full, but the actual unit there, it works out to over 90 cups of flour, which is an exceptional amount of flour to use to make bread when you've just said they're gonna have a little bit of bread. But in any event, Sarah is to get all of this really fine flour and quickly bake up some bread. He runs out to his herd, picks out one of his best calves and orders a servant to cook it. He brings some curds and milk for the guests to enjoy as they're waiting for the bread and meat. Abraham is just extravagantly hospitable here. Now, at first, the men are silent as Abraham stands by, but finally, one speaks. Where is your wife, Sarah? There, Abraham says, in the tent. The visitor replies, I will return to you this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. Now, Sarah, of course, at this point is eavesdropping. She hears what this messenger says, and we can imagine she just shook her head in disbelief. After all, it's the same story she'd been hearing now for over 25 years, and she and Abraham aren't exactly spring chickens anymore. I mean, the thing is, generally speaking, folks in their 90s aren't skeptical about their ability to conceive. They usually just accept that fact, that they will not conceive. And typically that's with some amount of relief, right? Years after this promise had been given to Sarah, when she and Abraham had heard the voice of God offering to bless them, they were now not skeptical of their ability to procreate. They knew that that time had passed. What they were skeptical about now was God's promise. So when Sarah hears this seemingly empty promise once more, it strikes her as, well, funny. Just like her husband Abraham did earlier, Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The man outside speaks again. Why did Sarah laugh? And before she can crawl to the back of the tent to hide in embarrassment, he continues, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah should have a son." Terrified at this man who has heard her thoughts, Sarah cries out, "I did not laugh." "Yeah, you did," says the guest. Or another way to recount this exchange would be this. Sarah says, "Surely you can't be serious." And God replied, "I am serious, and don't call me Shirley." If we were all here in person, I hope at least a few of you would have laughed at that really bad joke, if for no other reason than to help me feel better about having just told it. Laughter. What made you laugh? What made Sarah and Abraham laugh? What makes Sarah's situation so funny? Believe it or not, scholars have given a lot of time and thought to the issue of what makes us laugh and what actually constitutes humor. And they often narrow it down to two things: incongruity and surprise. So incongruity is when you take a couple of seemingly unrelated things and put them together. Things that don't belong together are. Surprise comes from introducing something completely unexpected. Now, the two ideas are closely related, obviously. They both capitalize on that twist, the unanticipated. I remember Bishop Don Chris, who was my bishop in Michigan when I served there. I remember him telling the story of going to preach at a congregation. And after he got there, he learned that he was also expected to give a children's message. So off the cuff, he thinks, okay, well, I'll just talk to the kids about my job as bishop. And so he gathers the kids around and asks, hey kids, do you know what a bishop does? And the kids look at him blankly. They have no idea. And so he starts to sweat. He's thinking, oh, this is going to be harder than I thought. But finally, one kid goes, oh, I know. And the bishop, relieved, turns to hear this young man's answer. And the kid proudly says, "A bishop moves diagonally." Incongruity and surprise. They make us laugh. But what happens when you have humor that has only incongruity and no surprise? That, I think, is when a laugh turns to an ugh. Sarah laughs at the incongruity. She laughs at how ridiculous it would be for an old lady to have a baby. But that's all she can laugh at. She doesn't expect any surprises from God. Her laughter is simply bitter and cynical. Probably much like our laughter over how terrible 2020 has been. Yep, there goes 2020 poking us in the eyes again. Ugh. Sarah hears the Lord say, "Your wife will have a son." And she can crack up in bitterness. But she's not able to hear God say, Is anything too hard for the Lord? In that moment, I think the messenger of God is inviting her to have a really good laugh and let surprise back into her life. And I believe God invites us to do the same. We are invited to stand in that space where we see that there are these things in our lives that just don't fit together, and consider the possibility of being surprised by God. When the incongruity of our lives meets God's great surprise of grace and promise, then we can laugh in a new way. Sarah can truly throw her head back and laugh with abandon when her son Isaac is born. In fact, Isaac's very name is a wordplay on the Hebrew word for laughter. Sarah says, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann talks about how the entire future of Israel depends in each generation on the capacity and resolve of God to make a way out of no way. This miracle of how God brings new life into situations that seem hopeless brings laughter. Sarah laughs. And for us as Christians, that laugh has become an Easter laugh. Brueggemann writes that this Easter laugh is a deep sweep of elation that looks death and despair in the face and mocks them. Our ancestral narratives attest to the power of God to create new historical possibilities where there is no ground for expectation. Our faith is one in which we believe that God can bring new life out of death. That resurrection is something that happens in us and to us as God's kingdom, presence, and power are breaking into our world today as a new creation has begun. We can hold on to that hope that God will yet surprise us. Yes, it's still 2020, and there are still plenty of things to say ugh about. And I'm not saying that we should ignore them or somehow not grieve or lament our losses. No, it's really important for us to be clear-eyed about the really hard things in our world today and the ways in which we are being called to bring justice and peace. But what are the things we find ourselves laughing at? Where are the promises of God at work, and in what ways? Are there promises that we have not yet allowed ourselves to believe or even hope for? This day, I invite you to be the one who laughs. Be open to laugh, not just at the incongruity of our lives, but also at God's gracious surprises. Amen.